Let's continue reading about the civil rights movement in America with What is the Civil Rights Movement by Sherri L. Smith. We're moving on to chapter 7. We've heard about some very important civil rights leaders, and we're going to learn about another one right now. So, chapter 7, The March on Washington. By 1963, there was a clear divide in the civil rights movement. One side moved carefully, while the other wanted immediate change. A political group called the Nation of Islam supported the idea of Black nationalism. That meant creating a separate country for Black people inside the United States. One of the leaders of the movement was a man who was named Malcolm X. He had been born Malcolm Little. Little was a name given to his enslaved ancestors by white men. He changed his last name to X to protest against slavery. Here's Malcolm X. Eventually, Malcolm X stopped believing in Black nationalism. He began practicing the Islamic religion. He changed his name to El Hajj Malik El Shabazz and began to favor more peaceful methods for gaining equality. Unfortunately, the Nation of Islam did not agree with his new ideas. He was killed by members of that group in 1965. Malcolm X once famously said, "We want freedom by any means necessary." This idea went against the nonviolent practices of Dr. King and groups like SNCC. Several civil rights groups joined together for a big protest to prove nonviolence worked. They would go to the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and demand equality. They called it the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Organizers were determined to hold a peaceful event with both Black and white marchers. This meant getting permits, buses, food, and bathrooms for 100,000 people. The march started at the Washington Monument and ended at the Lincoln Memorial. Abraham Lincoln was the president who ended slavery. There would be music from famous singers, and the leaders of the civil rights movement would speak on the memorial steps. Here's Abraham Lincoln. On August 28th, trains, buses, and carpools arrived from all across the country. One person traveled almost 700 miles to the march on roller skates. The crowd swelled to 250,000 marchers, more than twice the expected number. It was a hot day. People dangled their feet in the pool between the two memorials. They sang songs and listened to speeches. Near the end of the day, Dr. King spoke some of the most famous words ever heard. His I Have a Dream speech was carried to the listeners at the march and to TVs and radios around the world. "I have a dream," he said, "that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." He shared his belief that freedom would ring across the nation. All Americans would stand hand in hand and shout, "Free at last." The March on Washington was a great success, but for white supremacists, it was cause for violence. In Birmingham, that meant the deaths of 4 innocent children. On a peaceful Sunday morning at the all-black 16th Street Baptist Church, 4 girls were in the basement getting ready for choir practice. Here's the 16th Street Baptist Church. I heard something that sounded at first a little like thunder and then just this terrible noise, and the windows came crashing in, one churchgoer later recalled. But it wasn't thunder. It was a bomb. The 4 choir girls were killed instantly by the blast. Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley were 14 years old. Denise McNair was 11. Going clockwise, was it Addie Mae Collins, maybe this one, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair. President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964. People took to the streets to protest their deaths. Support for the civil rights movement grew. The time for change had come. The South would not budge. Lawmakers fought for 5 long months. At last, more than a year after President Kennedy had called for an end to discrimination, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 became law. It said the country would no longer allow discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, color, or national origin. Chapter 8, Freedom Summer. For laws to work, people must obey them. For laws to be fair, people must be allowed to vote. But white Southerners continued to block Black voters' rights. This was especially true in Mississippi. An American citizen must sign up in order to vote. There are offices to do this all over the country. It should be easy. But for Black people in the South, it wasn't. When they tried to register in Mississippi, they were given difficult tests about U.S. history, tests that white people didn't have to take. If Black people didn't pass the test, they couldn't vote. Sometimes they were even failed for their handwriting. Some voting offices were open only a few hours a day. They would keep changing their hours to make it harder to register. Black people would walk a long way only to find the office closed. Some people were charged a voting tax they could not afford to pay. Those who did manage to register found their jobs and lives threatened if they tried to vote, so they did not try. As a result, they were not represented in local government. The laws that favored white people and harmed Black people remained unchanged. In 1964, Black civil rights leaders decided to tackle the problem head on. The Council of Federated Organizations, COFO, would recruit Black and white student volunteers from around the country. These volunteers would travel to Mississippi to create freedom schools. The schools would educate Black people about their history and their civil rights. The volunteers would also help people register to vote. The project was called Freedom Summer. Hundreds of students signed up. They met on a college campus in Ohio to train in nonviolence and safety. They were told to dress well and to drive below the speed limit to avoid trouble with the local police. But trouble was waiting. On June 20th, the first volunteers headed to Mississippi. 3 of them went missing. Andrew Goodman and Michael Mickey Schwerner were both white men from New York. James Chaney was a young Black man from Mississippi. He had also been a freedom rider. After a tense search that lasted nearly 2 months, all 3 men were found dead. They had been killed by Klansmen working with the local police. Their deaths did not end Freedom Summer. Students of both races walked miles, stopping at houses and shacks to speak to poor people about their rights. They joined with local churches to sing freedom songs. For the first time in their lives, local Black people ate meals with white people. They opened their homes to the volunteers and learned that life could be different. By the end of the summer, Freedom Schools had taught over 2,500 children and adults. 17,000 Black people had attempted to register to vote. Even though many did not succeed, the volunteers also helped form a new group called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or MFDP. Nearly half of the people in Mississippi were Black, but only white people held government offices. The MFDP fought to bring equal representation to Mississippi. Still, it took new laws and 4 more years before the majority of the state's Black voters were fully counted. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Okay, so next time we'll go on with chapter 9. But so we see a new person. We see Malcolm X. We see that he started out at first thinking that it was okay to be violent against people that committed violence on you. But he learned differently as time went on. However, very sadly, I think his house was bombed or he was shot, I don't recall. But he was killed because he wanted equality. Many of the people that wanted equality were killed. It was a long, hard fight for Black people in America to get the civil rights that they deserve.